Thank you very much. It's been a while. I think the last time I spoke before the Anthropology Club, it may have been maybe 2004, perhaps. So it's been a minute since I've presented before you all. I'm glad to be here, especially by it being Black History Month. So before we get started, I want to ask a Black History Month question. I got a free piece of pizza for anyone who can tell me why Black History Month is in February. Go for it.
Because that is, they started it on the week of the birthdays of, I just lost their name.
Hook she nailed it.
The name, it started off on that week and then they decided to change it to go over the month.
Exactly.
It was in my Black History Month.
Woohoo. Yeah, very good. So it started as Negro History Week, and it was the week of Frederick Douglass's birthday and Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator. So their birthday is in the same week, and it started out as just covering that week. The most common answer given is because it's the shortest month of the year, and therefore we could, okay. But that's not the case at all. It has everything to do with starting as Negro History Week. The last time I was here, I was also in the philosophy department, which is no more. And so now I'm in the history department. And I just want to alert you all to a really interesting course that we're going to try to teach in the fall in history. I have all the particulars. But the course is going to be on 1968. All right, 1968, such a pivotal year in American history and sociology. And so we're going to teach this course as a team taught course across the department, looking at the various things that took place in 1968 as a way of talking about, the 50th anniversary of some of those momentous changes. So keep a lookout on that, because part of that will also be this shift in comic book culture. So for those of you who are, comic book geeks, we'll have at least one, if not more, sessions dealing with some of the major changes in the universe that took place in 1968. Okay, for those of you who know me, you understand that I'm a bit of a Luddite, right? I can see some of you repeat customers here, right? I'm terrible at answering email, right? All those things that are expected of us. And I have my reasons for wishing we all still wrote with fountain pens dipped in the latest inks from London. But every now and then, modern technology, including the expansive universe of social media, does me a solid and delivers on something that actually makes my day. This happened recently when I came across a pin on Pinterest in which a group of Black coworkers were standing around the water cooler, basking in the glow of the Black Panther and the marvels of a rich and glorious African past. A white coworker came to the fountain to get a drink and was slightly annoyed by the puffed out chests of her benighted brethren. She decided to bring them down a peg by injecting some truth into their conversation. And she said, and I quote, and remember this is just like a little meme, so it's not real, Pinterest, all right? "Do you know that Wakanda is not a real place?" she exclaimed. One of them turned to her and replied, "Yeah, and neither is Hogwarts." I'm glad you got it, good. Although Wakanda isn't a real place, it points to some very real themes and issues in American history. Wakanda and the Black Panther were born at a crossroads in the US social scene. The civil rights movement was actually in decline as nonviolent direct action was producing increasingly limited results. More and more young people were questioning the efficacy of the tactics especially in the face of the violent backlash to the Klan and other white supremacist organizations. And keep in mind, this is post Freedom Summer 1964, where 3 civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, were killed. Right? There were a number of civil rights murders that took place. Viola Liuzzo, a white housewife from Detroit, who went to Selma, Alabama in 1965 to help transport marchers back and forth from Selma to Montgomery. She got stopped by the Klan on one of those dusty Alabama roads, and she was shot to death. A Unitarian minister from Boston, James Reeb, was down just for the march, and he was branded a nigger lover by a white Klansman and hit in the head with a brick and killed. So all these things happened in a very short period of time, and it led particularly the young people in the movement, many of whom understood nonviolent direct action as a political tactic rather than a philosophy of life, to question whether or not this tactic was working anymore, and they even thought about just giving up for other things. Additionally, these youthful leaders in the movement for freedom, justice, and equality questioned the very notion of integration. What was really needed in black and brown communities was self-determination, they argued. And when we talk about integration, we often conflate terms like integration with desegregation, right? So desegregation really were those people who were arguing for the removal of all sorts of legal barriers. Integrationists were those who were then saying once those barriers have been removed, we have to find a way to fully bring people of different backgrounds together, right? And so many of these young people were desegregationists, right? They wanted the removal of the legal barriers, but they questioned whether or not integration should be the goal. Instead, they opted for what they considered to be self-determination, right? And what is self-determination? They argue that life wasn't better just because they had the opportunity to sit in the classroom with whites. Life gets better when one has some degree of control over the institutions that governs one's daily routine. All of this led to a turning away from whiteness and the embrace of a new black aesthetic, new standards of beauty, right? And this was revolutionary at the time, given all of the bombardment of images with regards to beauty that everyone was kind of doused with. And they were all, in some cases, European, right? There would be no more apologizing for being black. Instead, the rallying cry would be, black is beautiful, and I'm black and I'm proud. Hair straightening was out, and big and woolly naturals, as they called them, was in. Right? And if you know anything about straightening, and the first real black millionaire in the United States, Madam C.J. Walker, made her money off of products that helped straighten black women's hair so they were less kinky, less Afroid, and more European. In addition to that, she made a killing off of bleaching creams, right? Products that helped lighten one's skin so that you could have more of a European appearance. So by the time we get to the 1960s, the mid-1960s, the young people in particular are saying, to hell with that, right? We're done trying to mimic whiteness. Let's be proud of the fact we're black and embrace that. European business suits and ties were out, and the African-inspired dashiki was in. We've got this great family photo from like 1971. My sister, my mom, my dad, we're all in matching dashikis, right? With these African medallions on our necks. And when I look back on it, you know, we look kind of goofy, but it was a sign of the times. Everybody was trying to shift the way they thought, not just about culture, but certainly about standards of beauty, and style and dress included that. This black cultural nationalism was an important corrective to centuries of white domination. Black Americans turned to Africa to revise the story, including the lies they had been told about their past, especially the one that said that they had no past to speak of. So they searched for a history that demonstrated all the things that they had been told were actually false. that Africa had kingdoms and thriving governments long before European arrival on the continent, that Africa made significant technological advancements without the aid of Europeans, that Europe was not the center of God's concern. This last point was corroborated in 1974. Any anthropology students can tell me what corroborated this story in 1974? Student, thank you, student. Lucy, right? When a paleoanthropologist discovered fossils of what was believed at the time to be our earliest human ancestor, cultural nationalists and integrationists alike jumped on the claim of Ethiopia and East Africa as the cradle of civilization. And while I'm appreciative of the necessity of the shift in the 1960s and 70s toward a black aesthetic, partly represented by the explosion of black superheroes in the period, and people are talking right now about Black Panther, but there are a lot of others that came along at the same time. Shortly after Black Panther, we get Luke Cage. After that, we get Captain Africa. There are a whole host of black superheroes. And then going all the way up through the 80s and the 90s with Brother Man, the dictator of discipline, right? All these folks came on the scene, partly standing as a kind of symbolic corrective to this misinformation that's been provided for centuries. So while I appreciate the explosion of black superheroes in the period, Wakanda in the 21st century presents a set of serious challenges for historians. The blurring of the lines between myth and history, facts and alternative facts, sometimes makes it difficult to get across to a new generation the slow and subtle nuances of historical change. And so, you know, I'm kind of sensitive here, right? Because I'm a big fan of Black Panther and I just loved the movie. And I've seen it more than once and I'm going to see it again. But there's always that space, particularly as a black intellectual, where it becomes a problem when you challenge or say something in the public sphere that is in any way critical of something that is black and important, right? Because the overarching theme there is if you're black, historically, you don't get to be an individual, right? You don't necessarily have your own opinion, you have an opinion that reflects somehow badly on all of us, right? If some white guy commits a murder out here in Waynedale, I wonder how many of you think, damn it, he's messing it up for all of us, right? Probably not many, right? But if something happens on the news on the south side of Fort Wayne, African Americans feel as if that is not just one individual act, but somehow that thing is reflects on all of us in some particular way. So critiquing African Americans or things that are positive, like the movie, is sometimes seen as a real problem. Right? We had the same kind of thing when Obama became president. Right? You'd be hard pressed to find someone black who would say anything negative about Obama, even though he wasn't quite as progressive as some of us thought he was going to be. Heaven forbid you utter those words, and certainly not in mixed company, right? Meaning, you know. Anyway, let me move on. Yeah. So add to the mix the ways in which modern technology allows for the easy manipulation and alteration of people and narrative. And what we have today is a scenario where fiction easily passes as reality. And why not? I mean, who wouldn't want to claim Wakanda? Not only is it incredibly beautiful and home to the most precious natural resources in the world, it is also the birthplace of all civilization. I mean, heck, Captain America's shield is made from vibranium, which comes from Wakanda, right? So why not Wakanda? But the risk of sounding like an Uncle Tom, and if you had American Lit, you know Uncle Tom, right? Some of the implications of the black superhero narrative are counterproductive when they creep into the historical consciousness of mainstream media. In the face of the bell curve and other theories about black inferiority, superhero narratives are powerful symbolic correctives. But in reality, the really significant stuff that takes place, I mean, the game-changing historical moments, they really aren't all that sexy. If we look at President Barack Obama as one among many black superheroes, we can see both the symbolic positives as well as the problems he presents to positing alternative political narratives. When he won in 2008, black people celebrated the world over. Never again would a black child grow up thinking he or she could be whatever they wanted except president. If this self-made, self-described mutt from Hawaii with a funny name could make it, so could Shaquan from the south side of Chicago. The black savior had arrived, and all would be right with the world. Black people would be restored to a place of glory and achievement. For once again, the leader of the free world was a righteous brother with a little swagger and a pretty decent jump shot from the top of the key. And just to show how powerful the very idea of him was, the forces of evil got together and conspired to thwart every single proposal and policy prescription he recommended. If you remember our good buddy Mitch O'Connell, right? Is that his name? McConnell, Mitch McConnell. I blanked him from my consciousness, right? I mean, he got his buddies together and they publicly said, we're going to make sure nothing gets done, right? Our elected leaders were going to thwart governing to make sure this superhero did not succeed. Instead of a period of racial harmony, we experienced a backlash of hatred and vitriol that had not been seen since the Black Panther first emerged on the scene. Understanding Obama and his presidency in this heroic and symbolic light is important, and I in no way want to take anything away from what it has meant to our nation to elect a black president, given our racial past. Moreover, it must be noted that a very large number of whites had to vote for Obama to make it happen, verifying his position as America's leader, and not just the leader of people of color. What I'm trying to suggest, though, is superhero myths, when subtly accepted as historical, make it hard for historians like myself to set the record straight. Oh, we can say it, but it is harder for people to hear it, let alone for it to ever make it to the marketplace of ideas. If 50 Cent sells 5 million copies of a CD that is artistically weak and does not move the needle among true hip-hop heads, a record executive is not turning to his A&R department and asking for the best, most thought-provoking lyricist in the game. Instead, he or she is demanding, bring me the next 50 Cent. This becomes a problem when it comes to history. Now, let me provide one example from my own work that might help make the point. Just recently, I was chosen to write the memoirs of Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. And if you are looking at me right now in bewilderment, then I've already made my point. Right? If you don't know who Jesse Jackson is, Google him. Right? He was a guy who did a whole lot of firsts. Right? He ran for president, but amongst other things, he was well ahead of the game in the early 80s, proposing single-payer plan for insurance. He was the first candidate to appear before a convention and call for a two-state solution in the Middle East, and met with Arafat and other PLO leaders when our country was shunning them. Well before Richard Lugar said that an embargo of Cuba isn't working, Jackson said these sanctions are stupid, and actually went to Cuba, I think 1980, to make a point, right? So someone who was definitely ahead of the game in a lot of ways. Right? But among his many accomplishments, he was the first African-American to run a serious campaign for president. When I say serious, I'm not trying to take anything away from Shirley Chisholm's campaign, but in terms of the breadth of his as well as the impact he had, I would certainly say it was the first serious presidential campaign by an African American. In 1984 and again in 1988, Jackson blazed a trail along which Obama walked in 2008 and 2012. Jackson finished in third with over 3 million votes and nearly 400 delegates in his first run. And the second time, he had nearly 1,300 delegates. Two serious runs which Obama claimed inspired him to want to run for president one day. But Obama owes Jackson more than inspiration. He owes him his office. You see, after the '84 campaign, Jackson and his team were not happy. The rules were set up for the little guy to always lose. So at the convention, in a hotel suite with party officials, Jackson and his Rainbow Coalition hammered out a deal that would alter the course of history. Jackson demanded and got proportionality. Instead of primaries and caucuses being winner take all, they got a compromise that if a candidate got over 15% of the vote, then he or she would get a portion of the delegates comparable to the percentage of the vote. This is how Jackson was able to go from nearly 300 delegates in '84 to 1,300 delegates in '88. Now, fast forward to 2008. Hillary Clinton, she won California, she won Texas, she won Florida, she won Pennsylvania, she won New York, all of the really big delegate-rich states, and still didn't get the nomination. If the 1984 rules of winner-take-all had still been in place, she would have had a cakewalk to the nomination that year. Because Jackson and his team was able to get the rules changed after the 1984 election, Obama didn't have to win. All he had to do was to not lose big. Keep the races reasonably close and just keep collecting delegates along the way. He rode this strategy all the way to the White House, thanks to a non-sexy backroom negotiation 20 years earlier. Right? So it is not the superhero narrative that has no place. It is just that the power of it overshadows competing, and in most cases, complementary narratives that because of who we are and how we understand history, now hold very little weight. Another point in the Black Panther that has the same effect is that of the death of Eric Killmonger. Everybody remember Killmonger in the film, right? He's T'Challa's rival, evil cousin, and just all around kind of Billy Badass. As Killmonger is about to die, he asks only one thing, that he be buried at sea with all the slaves who jumped overboard during the Middle Passage, recognizing that it was better to die than to be in bondage. I love it. Courage and bravery in the face of death, not the fear and cowering that often accompanies media images of blacks. But what does it say about the millions of enslaved blacks who chose not death? What does it say about survival as a form of resistance to domination? Doesn't such a narrative devalue the experience of Killmonger's forebears, whose choosing of life allowed for his very existence? What does it mean for the countless men and women who endured suffering for righteousness' sake without allowing it to spoil their joy? Such narratives bring shame on enslaved people and their descendants, Killmonger's narratives. But I agree with Gandhi, who once said that there is no shame in being a descendant of a slave, but perhaps there is in being a descendant of a slave owner. Another painful narrative that runs throughout Black Panther is one of cultural and racial purity. If you have watched the film and watched it carefully, one of the things that distinguishes Killmonger from T'Challa is the fact that T'Challa is pure Wakandan and Killmonger is not. The fact that his father married an American woman is part of what makes him evil, right? He's lost his way. He's lost his sense of self. And his father did as well, for his father chose an American woman. And part of becoming Black Panther, one gets buried and they go to the place where the ancestors dwell. Remember that powerful scene where T'Challa gets to talk with his father. Everybody gets that moment except Killmonger. When he goes to talk with his father as he's becoming the Black Panther, where does he end up? Anybody remember? Back in the apartment in Compton, right? The dad's spirit has never had a chance to even migrate to the land of the ancestors. And it's all because somehow they transgressed this notion of cultural and racial purity. The other subtle theme there is all the things that are negative in the African world have somehow been introduced by Europeans, right? One of the things that makes Wakanda so perfect is that it's isolated, right? It's isolated because it's pretending as if it's a place that nobody wants to be, right? This is the way in which it's been able to protect its natural resources and all these things. So the sub-theme is there as soon as Europeans get involved, the game changes. How does it change? Everything goes to hell, right? So a theme that often goes unchecked, say anything negative, anything bad, anything perceived to be morally retrograde, has to be somehow a result of European colonization. Right? Because prior to the arrival of Europeans, Africans were incapable of doing bad by themselves. And so these are the kinds of things that I think need to be problematized when we watch these kinds of movies that are fascinating on their face, but a lot of people are taking them as some kind of, historical script and misunderstanding how to read history. More importantly, as a historian, I was just trying to note for you, these are the kinds of challenges we pose in doing our craft. How is it that you bring to light stories about the African American experience that may not be all that hip and sexy, right? When I teach my class on African American religion, everyone loves the story of Denmark Vesey. Anybody remember Denmark Vesey? Denmark Vesey, a free black in South Carolina who tried to lead a slave revolt in the late 1820s. And Vesey actually got some of the local country gullahs to get involved in this revolt and sent message to Haiti, which at the time was already a free republic, to try to get Haitians to come up. And they were going to set it off. They were going to get it started in South Carolina, but they knew eventually it would spread like wildfire, right? And Vesey's revolt got found out because somebody snitched. It's always a snitch, right? Somebody snitched, the thing fell apart, and they were all executed. It's a really powerful story about this attempt of these black Christians who were using the Bible as their source for their righteous indignation. When you tell other stories about how everyday common slaves just endured the experience, created institutions, maintained families in the face of the illegality of marriage, and all these sorts of things, they just don't have the same kind of impact as those kind of big, pushy stories like Vesey's Revolt. So, with that said, I want to end by saying, Wakanda Forever. If you haven't seen the movie, you really should do so. And I want to open it up now for questions. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, I think one of the messages, though, certainly at the end, although he was not the first to arrive at this, was T'Challa's decision to actually engage the outside world, as opposed to remaining. I mean, it was considered, I think, implicitly an error, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So at the very end of the film, I think they're before the United Nations or something, and T'Challa is announcing that they're not going to keep back all the stuff that they have. They're going to share it with the world. And of course, someone asked, what on earth could you possibly have that anybody would want? Right? So yes, they do arrive at that conclusion, and you're right that it wasn't something he came to initially on his own. The thing that still concerns me, though, is the theme of overcorrection, right? So the fear in having a situation that is masking or white supremacy on one hand is that in order to revise, what often happens is we go to the opposite extreme, right? And we end up with something that looks like black superiority, right? The Nation of Islam is case in point. right? So no, white people aren't gods, right? God isn't some white man sitting on some throne, right? Okay, we can all agree with that. Black people are gods. Wait a minute. You know, now you've gone to the opposite extreme. And so that's the thing that always has to be guarded against in just throwing those things out there. Wakanda is incredible because it's really superior in everything, whether the rest of the world knows it or not, right? And so I'm not saying that that's not a positive. I'm saying that there's always that other side of the coin that has to be watched. Yeah, but that's a good point. You had your hand on the back of the bus.
So I haven't seen the movie yet. I'm excited to see it, but I feel like an underlying message that you're talking about is the idea that just like pop culture and media does influence our understanding of history. So, do you have any practical tips for having a critical eye when, going to movies or something like that?
Read. Right? I mean, if the source of all your information is, Facebook, Snapchat, or whatever, we're in real trouble. And it's seductive and it's easy that way, but you gotta seek these things out for yourself. So someone mentioned right before we got started, right, talking about the Black Panther. And the assumption that people make is Black Panther, it's directly taken from the Black Panther Party. When in reality, the comic book came out before the Black Panther Party was even started, right? That's historical fact. But certainly in the consciousness of the Black Panther political party in Oakland, California, right? If you're talking about the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, that's different. Because that wasn't the official Black Panther Party. They had Black Panther as their symbol. It's always a smart ass in the room, isn't there? Yeah. So what he was about to raise his hand and try to correct me on, but I got him. So in 1965, when the march goes from Selma to Montgomery, there were a lot of students, particularly SNCC, a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that was not happy with the way the march was unfolding. And they were constantly challenging Martin Luther King Jr. and the more established middle-class leadership of the movement. And one of the things they were always upset about is that King would fly in, he would do these amazing events, thousands of people would show up, and then he'd be gone. And they're like, what are these people supposed to do now, right? So SNCC was all about trying to help create an indigenous leadership. How do we train people in these rural, poor counties to advocate for themselves? And so while they were marching to Selma, they were organizing along the way and came back and formed a political party in a county that was predominantly black and predominantly illiterate. They started this Lowndes County Freedom Organization. And because the people were illiterate, they said, okay, when you go in there, look for the Black Panther on the ballot. That'll be our symbol. So when you see the Black Panther, just put your X, right? That was before the comic book came out. That was in '65. The Black Panther Party, which people think about most often when they think about the Black Panthers in Oakland, came about later. But that's not all that interesting history, right? It's important. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that it's so much easier to conflate the comic book with, the image of the Black Panther Party, because, in California they had laws against concealed weapons. But you could walk around with a shotgun. Huh? Yes. And so the Black Panthers were armed to the teeth, right? Show up all the time for rallies and everything with weapons. I mean, it was a recipe for disaster, right? And became a reason for the FBI and others to COINTELPRO to exterminate. But read. Yes, that's the answer, yes.
One of the things that I love the movie too. There's so many interesting things. Usually superhero movies, I can't watch them because they're, I don't know, very simplistic. But there were some interesting stories and themes that were explored. But there was one thing that I was uncomfortable with, and it's something that in those other blockbuster movies that I've seen oftentimes appears there, and that's this glorification of monarchy. As an anthropologist, I mean, I think many of us, I particularly and other anthropologists, are very, we're a little bit skeptical about monarchy as a potential way of governing. And, you know, I don't know, in a lot of social movements, I think there's more of a tendency to construct themselves on a more democratic structure. So I'm wondering, do you have any way of thinking? I mean, Lord of the Rings is a good example of also another one where they glorify monarchy. And is this part of the superhero myth where we just love this figure, we have to turn to this figure, this savior? Or is this part of just this other kind of tension that people are talking about, the kind of the weakness of democracy in our culture? Maybe there is a lot of people are ambivalent about democracy and its potentials.
That's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that. I know in African American conversations, when people think about the glory of a historic past, it often goes back to a time where African American or Africans also had, you know, expansive kingdoms and, you know, broad wealth in the 14th century, you know, prior to Portuguese coming in the 15th century, you know, things like that. So I think there's some nostalgia for a period that, in some cases, I think is mythic anyway. If you look at, fast forward to the 1920s, Marcus Garvey, who led the largest movement of black people in the world, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, had chapters all over the world, right? Well, Garvey partly got started because he said, where's the king of black people? They have no true leader. Where is their kingdom? And so he established this organization, I think partly to elect himself king. This organization that was trying to move massive amounts of blacks back to Africa. It was bigger than anything King or anyone else had ever done. Of course, this is an aside, right? Historically, probably about 2 of you know about it, right? But it's such an important movement. The African American flag, red, black, and green, Marcus Garvey, 1920s. He was the first that I can know of to start a doll company. 1923, saying, you know, black girls need images of black beauty. They don't need to go to bed with a white doll. So Garvey started this doll company, way ahead of the game. Stuff we just don't know about. But it all started because he was in search of a black monarchy. So I think whenever there's this hearkening back to a golden era of African history and culture, monarchy is somehow central. So I think part of that theme is there. But I think you're right, it's something that needs to be questioned because even when we've had African democracies, they function like monarchies, right? You know, case in point, Zimbabwe is still trying to figure out how to effectively rid ourselves of Mugabe once and for all. But yeah, they get in, they get elected democratically, but all the governing aspects of it is very monarchical. You're going to ask it.
Yeah, what was my question? I was listening to the answer.
I'll talk to you.
No, here's a good, boring history question. Could you elaborate on Jesse Jackson's motives for proportionality? Was he foreseeing that this was a way to get African Americans into high office, or was it more abstract in terms of his motivation for proportionality?
Proportionality in his argument was about fairness. The rules are unfair. How is it that we can ever find opportunity for an outsider, a little guy who might have the best ideas, but not the best funded campaign, right, to actually make any headway? The only way you can do it is if you are actually given delegates in proportion to the amount of votes you actually get. It just makes sense. It's just fair. That's what he thought. There's no way in his mind we would ever get a woman candidate, a minority candidate without proportionality. And so he says that was chiefly his motivation. It wasn't necessarily even about him winning, right? It was about making an opportunity for someone to win. And so that's why he advocated. And lo and behold, like I said, without it, there's no way Obama could have been as successful as he was. Clinton would have walked over him because she won all the big states. Yeah, and he just was close enough where he could scrape up a significant number of delegates. Yeah. I mean, Jackson's first campaign was run out of churches and, everything else. It was on a shoestring. But he was Bernie Sanders before there was Bernie Sanders. All the things that Bernie is advocating, and Sanders was one of the first mayors, I think in '88, to endorse Jackson's campaign and worked hard to support Jackson in '88. Yeah. So yeah, he was an outsider, an independent, who was really trying to change the game for all, not just for himself. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I have a, okay, so I read an article that said that the different nations in Wakanda themselves try to stay true to African culture. Do you feel like the movie did it well with how they dressed and some of the rituals they were doing in Black Panther?
Right. Here's the interesting thing. When we talk about African culture, we have to recognize, we got to ask which Africa, right? So that's something that always concerns me. I mean, what do we do when we say African with Afrikaners? I mean, they're African. Well, yeah. No, I mean, where else are they going to go? Most of them have never been to Holland, The film borrows from various aspects of African cultures. And so you have some things that are clearly identified as South African, right? And I think some of that is owing to the reverence in African American culture for Nelson Mandela, right? So you see some borrowing of Zulu culture and the like. And then other things are clearly West African, right? So you can identify things like the Orishas, which are the traditional names given for gods in Yoruban culture. Black Panther, starting in the 60s, is already talking about the Orishas. And each of the major tribes is kind of governed by one of the Orishas. And it's the Orishas, these African gods from Yoruba, that actually give vibranium to Wakanda. So yeah, there are some things that are identifiable. But like much of African or African American representations of an African past, you always run into this notion of where'd I come from? How far back can I get? If I don't know exactly where I'm from, why can't I just claim it all, right? And so you see this kind of hodgepodge understanding of African culture that includes, Egyptology and all this stuff. So Wakanda kind of reflects that kind of grab bag cultural representation of Africa, right? When I put it in quotes, because sometimes you ask Africans about being African and they think of themselves, no, I'm Igbo, I'm Nigerian, oh no, I'm Hausa. They go all the way down to the ethnic group. So this concept of Africa is something that doesn't play always as well out in the African context itself. I went to Ethiopia and I was impressed, almost confused by how the fact that I see Ethiopians, they see 8 nations. We're a federation of 8 nations, right? And there are particular ethnic groups that represent as different nations. And just like in the film, they ascribe different attributes to the nations. This is the group that governs, right? The Amharic are the ones that have historically been in power. The official language is Amharic, blah, blah, blah. Oh, this group is really good at fighting. They're the warrior class. They dominate the military, right? Another group is excellent at business. And so you see the different ethnic groups having significant control over different aspects of the society. And the same thing, though, is kind of reflected in the way Wakanda kind of shakes out. But what's important about that in the film is that it tries to hold in tension the same way the comic book does, this traditional modern kind of thing. How is it that we make sense of holding on to traditional values and ideas and also engaging contemporary modern society? Yeah, good question. Someone over here? Someone had a hand? Bam, go for it.
I was just going to ask if you saw the piece yesterday in the Washington Post about it was very complex, but it was about Ethiopians kind of suggesting we are the true Wakanda, but without the technology. And then also some of the other African countries kind of, in terms of in the media, pushing back in the Twitter sphere or whatever and saying, well, you guys always think about it.
I did not see that, but it's interesting because being in Ethiopia, it's in the air. It's very clear that, dare I say, a significant number of them think that God shines on them in a special way, which is only verified by the fact that they have the Ark of the Covenant, right? So
the piece was making the point that they were occupied by Italians, but they were never colonized.
Yes, yes, and you hear that all the time. They make it very clear we were the only people in Africa who've never been colonized by Europeans. Although, you can get a very mean bowl of spaghetti in Ethiopia, and it's not uncommon for someone to say ciao, or, the main square in the town is often called the piazza. So I'm not quite sure what the big difference is between colonization and occupation, but this is the thing that they say distinguishes them. And the reason why they weren't is because God's presence there. I mean, there's no doubt that it's a part of the culture that the Ark of the Covenant is here in Aksum, right? And it goes back to our connection to the house of David. And the Bible clearly states the Messiah will come out of the line of David, right? And Haile Selassie, the power of the Holy Trinity, is from that line. And so all these things are what helped us, this little tiny country, kick the Italians' ass, right? I'm going to read that article, though. Yeah. Anything else? I owe you a slice of pizza. Yeah,
Who's your favorite Black superhero?
My favorite Black superhero is probably between Captain Africa, because it was something I read when I was a kid, and Brother Man, right? Brother Man came out around the time I was living in New York City, becoming a new parent myself, and I started collecting again Black comics because I had this idea, I'm gonna give all these things to my kids. It's never about the kids, right? Parents say that I'm doing this so I can have them for my kids. But what I liked about Brother Man was kind of the moral ambiguity. And the same with Luke Cage, right? Luke Cage is a kind of a reluctant superhero, right? He does good, but he gets dragged into it most of the time. He really just wants to be left alone, right? People keep asking him to do things for people, but yeah, okay. And so Brother Man is one of these people who doesn't mind getting his hands dirty for the right reasons. And so that kind of moral ambiguity plays to me a lot better than the kind of clarity of the self-righteous, superhero who's always, the person who's on the side of good and justice and fairness. Nah, that's not the way life really works, in my opinion. So that's why I think I'm drawn to someone like Brother Man. Yeah. I'm going to do my own one day, though. But it's going to be historical in nature, right? So I'm thinking about the Deacons for Defense. I don't know if you know anything about this organization. The religious studies professor, right? The Deacons for Defense was a social organization that was formed in Louisiana in the early 1960s. They weren't really followers of nonviolence, and they decided, deacons, right, church people, they decided that they're going to ride shotgun, literally, with civil rights workers, right? People getting killed across the South. They're not getting killed here, right? Because the Deacons for Defense, most of them military vets, right? some of them fresh back from Vietnam and Korea and other places, were trained almost like a little paramilitary group, church people now, I don't want to lose that fact, to protect and defend, civil rights workers in their territory. And so it's one of those organizations that are not really known about that well, but I thought it'd be great kind of a fact-based comic book. Church people who are also not scared to shoot people. For the right reasons, of course. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, have you ever considered Joseph Campbell's hero's journey cycle and how it might apply to these various different myths that you're talking about? And I don't know if you're necessarily familiar with this kind of anthro thing, but because Nora's question got me thinking, has there ever been a hero that was like a hero for democracy? And I could actually think of a couple that would fit that cycle, but it's a couple. All other myths that you could consider tend toward this kind of authoritarian leader.
Mm-hmm. So who are the couple that you would consider?
Kind of the way we've mythologized George Washington's life and rise to power and everything, kind of mix of fact and fiction and everything. Mm-hmm. And I could see how some of the phases that Joseph Campbell said, all of these myths, no matter where you see them in the world, how he kind of goes through them, and maybe Lincoln, and then and JFK maybe, and now I'm running out of.
No, I had not thought about it. This is one of those I guess one of those disciplinary boundaries that, there are a lot of other things I would have considered, but something from anthro never occurred to me. And I think that's just a shortcoming of the academy, that somehow we get in our silos sometimes, and we read the 4 or 5 theorists that we know well and don't really think about how other things can shed light on what it is that we do.
I'm reminded of your advice, Professor, to the student. Gotta read, man.
Gotta read. I'm sorry.
Educate yourself.
And I don't read fiction. I'm joking. It's a joke. Any other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I was just going to say, I don't know if you listened to the 1A on NPR, but they had a discussion of the movie last week, and they were talking about the movie more as kind of inspirational for like an imagined place, an imagined reality that is inspirational and that hasn't existed, at least not in the mainstream culture and media. Mm-hmm. Just thought it was kind of an interesting conversation they had.
Yeah, but my concern is how the imagined place gets kind of mythologized as somehow part of some historical narrative, and what some of the concerns I have as a historian for that. And it's subtle and kind of just creeps in. It's not that the filmmaker was intentionally trying to do this. It's the way in which we receive the information, I think, in the 21st century, and the role that technology plays in that makes it easy for those kinds of.
But let me ask you a question. As a historian, don't you find that you constantly have to fight against unidimensional, flat versions of historic figures and their contributions? I mean, they're very unidimensional kind of cutouts. People, Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, all these people from history that are represented fairly or unfairly, very unidimensionally. I mean, it's constantly your job, right?
That's true. That's true. And, to be honest, I prefer dead people. I mean, like way dead. Yeah. I mean, 19th century really is my love. And I kind of found my way to civil rights in the 20th century because I happened to be working with a dissertation advisor who at the time just received a huge grant to do a religious history of the civil rights movement. And of course, he required graduate students to do research. And even though it wasn't my area, I'm like, hey, money, grad student, that's where I am. And so I jumped to the job, and a few years later, he died before I finished my dissertation. But since I was his last graduate student, people were calling on me to do all the stuff that he was doing. Well, did you work with him on the Civil Rights Project? Yes, I did. So we're having this conference at Harvard Divinity School, and we want you to take his spot. He was scheduled to speak. I'm like, okay. And so I show up and I speak at the conference. I probably oversold and underproduced, but as a result of that, there was a film company there, Black Side, that made Eyes on the Prize. They say, we're working on this documentary on black religion. Will you be a historical consultant? Okay. I was a visiting assistant professor. I hadn't even finished my dissertation yet. And then from there, Black Side says, I want to write this book to go with the film. And Juan Williams is going to write it, but he doesn't know anything about black religion. Will you co-author it with Juan Williams? Okay. And so, you know, the trajectory of my career just kind of went from 19th century Black Baptist to, you know, 20th century. My advisor was best friends with Cornel West. So Cornel West said, we need to do something as a memorial volume, but I'm too busy. Will you edit it? And we'll both put our names on it. Okay. A graduate student, I got a book with Cornel West. I didn't really do anything other than be the student of this guy who died. And it just kind of just changed the whole course of my life. So yeah, you're right. All that to say, yeah, you're right. Okay, it must be 1 o'clock because she's leaving, so.
I got work.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Nothing else? Appreciate it.